stories of blood-sucking monsters are universal and have been around for centuries. There's the Greek Lamia, the Chinese Changxi, and the African Asanbosam, to name a few. But let's focus on the one who has outlived them all, whose monstrous legend lives among us even today, Count Dracula. I'm Dr. Emily Zarka, and this is Monstrum. The stories of blood-sucking monsters constantly shifts to reflect the culture and issues of its time. For instance, there are real-life diseases with symptoms similar to the traits found in some vampires. A sensitivity to light, a sudden decline in health, even the desire to bite other people. So before we understood concepts like viruses and germs, creating a fictional explanation makes a lot of sense. Also, if you look at the sharp teeth and long fingernails of the typical Western vampire and how they use these to attack their prey, the vampire becomes a metaphor for humans' capacity for great violence. Vampires often appear humanoid and primarily attack humans, so associating their violent attacks with the violence we see in the real world is easy, because both predator and prey look like us. We can find this monster in folklore, legends, and literature long before the word vampire appears for the first time in English around 1730. However, it wasn't until the Irish author Abraham Bram Stoker wrote his 1897 novel Dracula that the characteristics of this creature became widely recognizable in the modern world. Stoker actually started outlining the novel in 1890, years before he even encountered the name Dracula. We know this because he wrote notes. A lot of notes. Emily Gerard's book of Transylvanian Superstitions, The Land Beyond the Forest, and Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould's The Book of Werewolves were two books which clearly inspired him. He clipped newspaper articles, recorded tombstone inscriptions, and transcribed ship captains' logbooks to make his narrative more realistic. He was also influenced by Victorian theater, including his friend and employer, the actor Henry Irving. It is most likely that he read the name Dracula for the first time in William Wilkinson's book, An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, while on vacation with his family, after he had already started writing the story. In tradition with a lot of Gothic literature, Dracula is a member of the aristocracy, which also explains the dramatic castle setting and the Count's great wealth of old gold. In his memos, Stoker combined many existing literary and folklore traits that we now see as typical vampire characteristics. No reflection in mirrors, never eats or drinks, has enormous strength, and the ability to see in the dark. It was already accepted that vampires could turn others into the undead, have large canine teeth and pointed nails, and be vulnerable to garlic and wooden stakes. But Count Dracula was the first vampire to have all of these traits. And influenced by werewolf legends, Stoker gives Dracula the ability to shapeshift into a bat, a wolf, or mist, a first for vampires. 7 years of making vampire notes paid off, and when the book was finally published, it was a critical and popular success. The 1922 movie Nosferatu, which tells the Dracula story with a few name changes, was not authorized by Stoker and came dangerously close to copyright infringement. Stoker's widow even tried to have the film removed from public circulation. The controversy surrounding the film increased the popularity of both the book and the Count himself. The prevalence of Dracula movies in the 40s inspired a 16-year-old Richard Matheson to contemplate his own version of a vampire tale. He wondered, quote, if one vampire was scary, a world filled with vampires would be really scary. Matheson published I Am Legend in 1954, telling the story of the only apparent human survivor in New York City after a vampire plague infects the population. Matheson's vampires become monsters not from a bite or curse, but because of the vampirus virus. This is one of the first times the metaphor of vampirism as a disease is explicitly stated. Urbanism, immigration, sexually transmitted disease, politics, corporate greed, capitalism, racism, sexism, the fetishization of youth. These are only a few of the things vampires have represented. In 1975, Stephen King's Salem's Lot modernizes Stoker's original story. King admits he was inspired by Dracula, as well as the divisive political atmosphere at the time in the United States that in King's own words gave him a, quote, fear of the future. Fun fact, thanks to the window scratching scene in the TV movie version of Salem's Lot, the first monsters I remember being really scared of were vampires. Which, given that I am now an expert in the undead, is so perfectly ironic I could die, and then reanimate. It wouldn't be a post-Dracula vampire episode if I didn't mention the two names that made the modern vampire sexy: Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series. In 1976, the publication of Interview with a Vampire introduced the world to the beautiful, soulful Louis, whose cold, dead heart is still capable of love and regret. Rice gave us the first reluctant vampires in literature, those who are more concerned with self-identity and morality than any previously portrayed.
Kill them swiftly if you will, but do it! For do not doubt, you are a killer, Louis!
Then in 2005, we were given the brooding, abstinent vegetarian Edward Cullen in Twilight. Meyer makes turning someone into a vampire the most romantic thing you can do, because it ensures you and your true love will be together forever. Also, vampires now sparkle. Thanks for that. Other vampire stories reframe the undead monster in exciting ways. Jewel Gomez's The Gilda Stories features a Black feminist vampire heroine who uses her undead life to explore her education and her sexuality, while helping to create progressive change in society. Octavia Butler's Fledgling features vampires who actually engage in symbiotic relationships with those they feed from. The narrative addresses themes of polyamory, intimacy, race, and genetic experimentation through the eyes of a Black female protagonist. In contrast, Guillermo del Toro's The Strain trilogy gives us parasitic worms who inhabit living human bodies, and whose failure to value human life makes them monstrous even without their need for human blood. Even though all modern vampire stories have their roots in Stoker's original Dracula, each one is unique in its interpretation. As times change, so do vampires. The vampire reflects the culture and time of its creation. I wonder what form they'll take next. Who is your favorite literary vampire? Let me know in the comments. I'm partial to Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla and Eli from Let the Right One In.